My name is Martha Rogers. I'm a priest in the ECC, a member of St. Matthew's Church, and I have a ministry in Anaheim called St. Junia's House, which is mostly young adults. We are gathered today for an incredibly special event. We have a scholar from Denmark who has written this. I'm going to get my brain lift to the end. This book called Love Lost in Translation, Homosexuality in the Bible. It's available in paperback, if you would call it that, on Amazon, and it's also available for Kindle very inexpensively. And so today we are honored to have Dr. Renato Leens from Denmark, who is going to lead us in some understanding about translation and interpretation and background on the passages in the Bible that have been so problematic in terms of our understanding of sexuality. So I welcome you, Dr. Leens, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Reverend Rogers. First of all, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
And will everybody be able to see the screen as we proceed? Good.
And you do have in here the copy of the PowerPoints that he'll be using today.
Right. I also want to thank the ECC for this invitation to come to this place and speak about a subject that I care passionately about. After all, it takes some passion to spend 10 plus years of your life to do research into a subject and then produce a book. But it has been for me a journey of joy and enrichment. So thank you all for being here and making this event possible. Before I start showing you my presentation, maybe I should mention that you are going to see a slightly updated version of the printout you have in your folders. Much of the material is the same, but some details may vary, so just be prepared for that. I am told by the Reverend Rogers that this updated version will be made available at a later stage, so don't despair if there's some discrepancy between one or two of your images and what I'm actually saying. Another thing I would like to emphasize before I go into our subject matter is we're structuring this session in 3 parts. Part 1 is going to be a discussion of some of the problematic aspects of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Part 2, some of the problematic aspects we find in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 1. And part 3, we're going in an entirely different direction. We will do a Bible study of the book of Ruth, which gives you a very different perspective on the whole issue we're talking about. And this different perspective is important to keep in mind because the first 2 parts I'm going to show you are actually irrelevant, in the sense of not relevant for current discussions on same-sex relationships in the Bible. But I'm bringing them in, despite their irrelevance, I'm bringing them in because historically they have been quoted over and over and over in this context. And the problem then is, as I think you will be able to appreciate, that there's a gap between these texts and the actual discussions we're having. They are addressing very different concerns. So that's part of the problem that actually brings us here and why this whole debate is raging out there in the big bad world. So let us now, without further ado, go to a famous city that we find in the book of Genesis. And I'm calling it 4 gates to the city because you can take different approaches to it, historically speaking. to understand what's going on there, and I'm trying to bring out the differences between these different four approaches. It's a complex story, as I'm sure you'll soon appreciate, and those of you who had a chance to look at my book will go, oh my God, there's a lot going on here. There really is. So I'm going to give you a simplified version. If you want further details, there's plenty to be found in this book. In fact, you won't believe it, but the story of Sodom and Gomorrah occupies 5 chapters in here. So there's to your heart's delight. So I am Christian myself. I was born and raised in a Christian environment and given a Christian education. This was Church of Denmark, which is Lutheran primarily, and I should also say that my parents belonged to the more puritanical side of the Lutheran Church. And I then choose to analyze this text from a Christian perspective because that's the tradition that I'm familiar with, and also because that tradition presents more problems than any of the other ones available. Maybe except Islam, but that's a different matter. But the Christian tradition is highly problematic when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah. Here's a quick outline of the way I'm trying to, or I'm focusing on this subject. A quick introduction about where the problems lie. Then the 4 different approaches, I call them gates. It's like having an ancient walled city and you can have a gate on each side of it. So I'm choosing to call them gates, and then conclusions towards the end. So here are the 4 gates, or paradigms if you're into that kind of terminology. That's fine with me too. I think I actually mainly use paradigm in the book, so now you're prepared for that. But here we're going to talk about gates. So I'm going to talk about the characteristics of each gate, A, B, C, and D, and look at some significant aspects that often have been overlooked. This image probably comes as no surprise to most of you. It seems to sum up almost what we know about Sodom and Gomorrah and what happens there. You can see in the background fire and brimstone raining down from the sky on the sinful city. And in the foreground you have 3 persons. Maybe you can see from where you are. An elderly man, probably Lot, Abraham's nephew with his 2 daughters. And then further back, a woman who had turned into a pillar of salt. Lot's wife, who famously turned back at a moment which she wasn't supposed to and remained there, petrified. So, let me go to the introduction and look at the problem areas that we currently find when scholars and theologians and many others are discussing the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, one problem area I really feel is important to bring out is that lots of scholars, actually 9 out of 10, when they're commenting on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis, they almost automatically go on to talk about a similar story in the book of Judges, 2 chapters 19 and 20, because there are certain similarities in the plot. So they read them virtually together under the same lens. And that is problematic for many, many reasons. Because when you start analyzing them, and I have a long chapter on that other story in Judges 19 and 20, you will see how many elements are actually quite different from what goes on in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So I don't particularly find this approach helpful. They're all interesting stories in their own right, but I feel uncomfortable when we actually have to read them in parallel, because they are different and making quite different points. So, another problem area, and you probably all in this room have heard the saying, and maybe even you use it, to know in the biblical sense. Right? We all know what that means. That kind of thing. It's a huge problem when you come to Sodom and Gomorrah. Because in these two cases, Genesis 19:5 and 19:8, we have the men of Sodom saying to Lot, let us know then about the two visitors who have come to town. And then in 19:8, Lot speaks about his two daughters who have not known the man. And virtually all commentators say, well, this is obvious. This is all about sex. The men of Sodom want these two visitors for sexual purposes, and Lot is trying to avert that. And they say, oh no, I have two young daughters here, you can have them instead. So this is sort of the simple and easy way out of the story. And I mean this literally, because that takes about 2 minutes to make that connection. What really takes time is to understand what's going on underneath. And that is why I have written all these chapters. And there's a reason for this, even a technical one. When you look at the word to know, you can see in the middle in black, 19:5 and 19:8. That's where these two famous quotations we just saw around Lot's house, where we think it's sexual because that's sort of the obvious way from our cultural perspective. But people leave out the other four. And now I'm a linguist, and I have been trained in literary analysis, and there you're taught, look at the whole text before you make up your mind about what a certain word means. And if it occurs several times, you should look at the whole, not just pick one or two. So there's a rather difficult issue here of methodology. Too many people rush in and take the two in the middle and leave out the other four. And I say you can't really do that if you're serious in linguistics. Certainly, you would fail the test if you did that. But it's happening all over the place. Well, there's a long tradition telling you to do it this way. And the problem is with the other four cases, yada, the Hebrew word for to know, cannot possibly be sexual. Because if you do that, the whole story comes apart. So there's something really very important happening here. Another mistranslation which is little understood and little noticed, I'm just bringing it in to let you know there are several places in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah where the translators got it wrong. And this is another one. In 19:9, we have the story where, maybe you remember, Lot comes out of the house and he stands with his back against the door, right? And all these people, all these men of Sodom are all around the house and he can't move from there. He's just standing there protecting his doorway, virtually. And so there's an old translation mistake that goes all the way back to the first Greek translation ever made, which says aposta in the Greek, stand aside, step aside. And in the Latin that became recede, which means stand back. But the Hebrew doesn't mean that. The Hebrew always meant draw near. So they're actually men who are actually ordering Lot, come over here. You know, they want to arrest him because he's being disobedient. So here we get the opposite situation here. Because there's an old tradition telling us this is what that means, people actually don't even see the word any longer. So another major problem we have here in Sodom and Gomorrah. So now I'm going to go to gate A. This, I've just pointed out two major issues, translation issues in the story itself. Then how was it understood? That's important for us to know, right? I mean, how did the early listeners and readers understand the story? Particularly those who wrote and spoke the same language. That, for me, that's the first port of call. When you want to understand an ancient text, go to other sources, how did they understand it and how did they interpret it? So this is gate A, the earliest witnesses we have. We find them in the prophets. Sodom and Gomorrah is a famous story almost from day one. And almost all the prophetic books comment on it. Particularly, you find an eloquent, almost emotional reaction to these stories in Isaiah chapter 1 and in Ezekiel 16. They share, I put there classical Hebrew because this is the same language as the story was composed in. So here you have two prophetic approaches to Sodom and Gomorrah. And what do they say? Well, Isaiah addresses the rulers of Sodom and the people of Gomorrah in chapter 1. And I won't put a small fraction in here, but I recommend reading Isaiah chapter 1 because it's very eloquent poetry, full of potent, powerful images. So he's addressing the people of Gomorrah and the rulers of Sodom, criticizing them for all their religious ceremonies and for their slaughters of animals and sacrifices and all the rest of it, when he's saying that is not what is important. And God is even saying, I don't want all your sacrifice. There's blood on your hands. He's saying, wash yourselves, make yourself clean. And then he finishes by, cease to do evil, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. So this is Isaiah's witness in connection with Sodom and Gomorrah. Quite a different one than we're used to. Ezekiel has to say, he's saying to his fellow citizens of Jerusalem, was not Sodom a byword in your mouth in the days of your pride, before your own wickedness was uncovered? So what then is the wickedness of Jerusalem? Well, Ezekiel refers back to Sodom again, saying this is the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, and incidentally pride with the prophets usually means arrogance, but did not aid the poor and needy. Again, you have this strong concern for social injustice that we saw in Isaiah as well. And Ezekiel goes on to say, look at this. You, Jerusalem, have committed more abominations than Sodom. Strong language. So for the Hebrew prophets, I'm now summing up, Sodom represents particularly 4 issues that were contentious for the prophets. Idolatry, worship of wrong gods, arrogance, social injustice, and oppression and violence. My connection between this and the story in Genesis, I looked and I looked. This is one of the things I've been trained to do, to look for clues within the same books that you're actually reading, rather than going outside the Bible and finding clues elsewhere. First look for clues inside the Hebrew Scriptures, and I found the clue in Exodus 22:21. The verse goes, now I'm just quoting a little bit from memory, you shall not mistreat the foreigner living among you, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. If you do mistreat him, I will surely hear his outcry, and my anger shall burn. Now think of the anger, burning anger raining down on Sodom and Gomorrah. So in this verse in Exodus, we see that the poor and the oppressed who appeal to God, cry out to God when they are being mistreated, are foreigners, widows, and orphans. So here we have then, summing up the victims of Sodom are the most vulnerable citizens, widows, orphans, and resident aliens. And the only, if we move over to Genesis 19, if we look for those, we find a resident alien. His name is Lot, and his family. So they are the ones who are being oppressed in the context of the Hebrew Scriptures. The resident alien with no rights. So now I'm going further and we're going up to gate B, and we'll see a change now occurring. Here, we're now moving into the Hellenistic era, so it's no longer Hebrew that we are seeing as the main language. Here we have Greek moving in. That's typical of the Hellenistic age. So we have some literature, the Apocrypha, and the New Testament Gospels. We find a different take on Sodom and Gomorrah. Particularly, I will mention the Book of Wisdom and the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, all of which were written in Greek. They bring in a new subject that wasn't there in the early sources. They all talk about inhospitality to strangers. And you might make a case for that, because when you analyze the story, you say, well, there is something happening here. The strangers were not well received and so on. But this now becomes the main focus, which is interesting. So they're leaving out the social injustice and oppression, and now it's inhospitality. Oh, I'll take that back. They're leaving out the social oppression and injustice towards resident aliens, and now they're focusing on visitors. So there's a major shift occurring here. The visitors staying at Lot's house now become presented as those who are suffering the sin of Sodom. So we have now, you can see the major differences between these two gates that I have just presented to you. In gate A is the vulnerable residents, and in gate B is visitors who are victims of the sin of this place. So we've got two gates now, we've got two more to go. Here comes gate C, and again we will see a change occurring. Gate C is, we're still in the Hellenistic era. There's a whole lot of things happening in the Hellenistic era. I mean, people are writing books bigger than mine about what's going on in those things. So now we have another approach to Sodom and Gomorrah, coming in a different literary context. These books are often called the pseudepigrapha, and they're books that never made it into the Bible. Right? There was lots and lots of stuff being written, and some of it made it into the Bible, some didn't. And these didn't. So you have the book of Enoch, the Assumption of Moses, the book of Jubilees, Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, and so on. And here you find a different concern in relation to Sodom and Gomorrah. In the pseudepigrapha, they talk about idolatry and apostasy. Well, we've seen some of that in the earlier approaches. Apostasy, this is particularly aimed at the Jewish community, somebody who leaves their Jewish faith, for example, through intermarriage, and then give that up. That's a major concern at this time. Okay? And then finally, and this may become fatal, probably has become fatal, illicit sex comes in as a new issue that wasn't there before. So, if we go to the New Testament, there's two reflections of these pseudepigrapha, these new writings. We find it in the letter of Jude and the second letter of Peter. And in those two places we find this new take about illicit sex, which is nowhere else in the Bible. So according to Jude verse 7, and Jude is inspired by the pseudepigrapha that I just mentioned. So this is where they find the writer of Jude took inspiration. The people of Sodom committed fornication, sexual immorality, and went after other flesh, a rather cryptic phrase in any language, I would say. But if you read the pseudepigrapha, you will probably realize that Jude is alluding to sex between human beings and heavenly beings, like angels. Hence the other flesh. So, the novelty in Jude is this the first canonical writing, the first writing included in the Bible, where the name of Sodom is linked to sex, particularly illicit sex. And in 2 Peter, there's an echo of Jude. 2 Peter was written later. and they're leaving out some of the material mentioned in Jude, but still there's an echo. And they're saying here in 2 Peter that the people of Sodom indulge their flesh in depraved lust. So now you have a major shift occurring again in gate C, because only in Jude and 2 Peter do we find references to illicit sex in the context of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, finally, to gate D. And this is very important for all of us in this room, because now we're moving into the Christian era. We will see another shift. We've already seen several. As if that weren't enough, now another shift will occur. And we're still in the Hellenistic era, so I think you're beginning to get my point about the Hellenistic era as one of huge diversity and lots of creativity. Gate D is important, and it begins in the 1st century, before the Christian era and the first. He straddled the 2 centuries. And Philo is a Jewish philosopher living in Alexandria, read the Hebrew scriptures in Greek translation, because Greek was now the main language, and wrote in Greek. And he writes very elegant Greek, so he was definitely an educated man. But it's important to remember he read the Bible in translation. He did not study it in Hebrew. And that is perhaps one of the reasons why you will see that Philo's approach is very different from that of the prophets. They are in 2 very different places. So Philo wrote in Greek, and he brings in a new subject in relation to Sodom, namely the institution of pederasty. Now, I don't know how familiar you people in this room are with pederasty. For some, it's a word in a dictionary, and we don't see it much practiced in our culture, do we? Pederasty is a Greek term meaning love of boys. It's not the same as pedophilia, because that has other connotations in our culture. Pederasty was more, it's a reference to the classical Greek culture, where it was, at least for several centuries, according to our sources, was considered normal and respectable for men of good standing to be married and raise children, and on the side have a young male disciple or student with whom they would spend lots of time and often sleep together. So that's a pederasty. It was considered an educational thing with all these components, where the older man was supposed to pass on all his skills and knowledge to the younger. So all of that goes into pederasty. But by the time Philo comes in, now we've moved on a few centuries, by the time he comes in, he has a very different take on pederasty. He sees it more like something like prostitution happening in the streets of Alexandria. So that colors his vision very strongly. And this is picked up, Philo's approach is picked up by the church fathers, including John Chrysostom and Jerome. Jerome wrote in Latin, translated the whole Bible into Latin, became world famous for that. Here it is, in a much later edition, the Vulgate, Latin Vulgate. And Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century. So what's important here is that Greek, John Chrysostom wrote in Greek, I forgot to mention that. But anyway, you'll forgive me, I hope. But what becomes important increasingly in the western part of the Christian church is Latin. Because Rome becomes the center with the popes and all that, so Latin becomes the main language. And here the focus is very clearly on same-sex eroticism. We've come quite a long way now, we can see, from the Hebrew prophets. Through different languages, and now suddenly we're in a very different place. This continues through the Middle Ages, and now we arrive at the 11th century. Italy, there's a monastery, and we have a man named Peter Damiano, who invents a new word. Up until this time, the theologians had talked about vice, unnatural vice. Some had used sodomitic vice as a reference to same-sex relations. But here comes Peter Damian, and in one fateful paragraph, in a letter he's sending to the Pope, comes a new word, sodomy. It is only 1,000 years old. Many people think, oh, it must be in the Bible, sodomy, Sodom. Anyone can see the connection, right? But sorry, it's only 1,000 years old. And when you read Peter Damian, it's not very edifying reading, I would say, the letter to the Pope, but you can still understand his concern. Because what he's concerned about, guess what? He is seeing his colleagues. He's made his vow of chastity, and he's celibate. By the way, the 11th century also sees the compulsory, mandatory celibacy being enforced. That was not mandatory before. But from the same time that this word appears, we have mandatory celibacy, which is important to remember. So, Peter Damian, who's living a chaste life and he's celibate, he's seeing some of his monk friends and priests and bishops. They kind of sort of walk around a bit hand in hand, in couples, and he's concerned about what's going on here. Are these people living up, to their vows of chastity or not? So, and he then concludes, no, they're not. We have handed our lives over to God, so people shouldn't have anything there going on the side. So he writes this vehement protest. He sends it to the Pope, complaining about these things. And he sets a precedent, and a very strong one, with sodomy. In fact, he's saying, if blasphemy, blasphemy was sin number one in the Middle Ages. Any blasphemy could probably have you executed. If blasphemy is the worst sin, I do not know in which way sodomy is better. So now you have an idea where we're heading. In fact, he places them on the same level. Sodomy and blasphemy. This is picked up by a number of theologians after Peter Damian. Peter Cantor takes it up and even extends it to women. So even intimate relations between two women are now also classified from the 13th century as sodomy. And Thomas Aquinas, one of the great figures of this time, he picks it up. Then you would think, well, when it comes to the Reformation, they could do away with all that, right? Because they talk about returning to Scripture and everything will be fine and so on. And they did their best, but sorry, they didn't even notice there was an issue here. So they just took this over. From the medieval theologians, they continue Martin Luther's thoughts and what words. Sola scriptura, scripture only. They wanted to return into the original languages, study it in Hebrew and Greek, and they did their best. I'm not sort of really trying to knock anybody. We all do our best. But in this particular field, they accepted the word sodomy without even examining it, because that becomes so familiar. So that carried on into the Reformation. So, the Christian tradition, what they have to say about Sodom is basically the sin of Sodom was same-sex eroticism, same-sex desire. So much so that when the Inquisition comes along, you have here an illustration of what might happen. If two men got convicted of sodomy, this is what you can see them there in the middle. They're being burned at the stake, and the people of the town standing by watching. So let's conclude now. Okay, The original approach to Sodom and Gomorrah, we find it in the Hebrew prophets. They speak about gross social injustice and mistreatment of resident aliens. But 3 new gates or paradigms have come about. Gate B, we saw how inhospitality becomes the main focus, and still is, by the way, in many Christian churches today. Illicit sex gets introduced with gate C, sexual relations that are not considered kosher. And then gate D, it becomes specific. Now it's same-sex eroticism that gets targeted. So, to sum up the Christian approach, it has strong roots in the Hellenistic era and in the Middle Ages, particularly indebted to those who wrote in Greek and Latin. And unfortunately, along these centuries, Christianity has lost the connection with the prophets. We have lost view of the social injustice and the mistreatment of the poor and downtrodden, including the resident aliens. I've got further questions. Well, there's an interesting book here you may want to check out. So that will be my contribution to the discussion of Sodom and Gomorrah. How are we doing? What time? Are we doing all right?
Yeah.
Okay. I believe now we have got some minutes. If some of you or whoever has a question or comment or doubts about some of these issues, because as I said, it's very complex and it takes a little time to digest. But I'm quite open to hearing from you.
A lot of what you're talking about is occurring more recently on social media. And you can find that I spend most of my hours on Facebook, but there's a lot of web pages and a lot of individual posts related to this that agree with the hypothesis. And you break it down into much more detail than maybe, of course. You break it down into more detail.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
But essentially the conclusions are the same, except that the medieval translators got it wrong, and it carries forward to this day.
That is true. And let me add to this, thank you, that I'm not inventing this out of the blue. I'm standing on the shoulders of a lot of scholars who've come before me. And so I'm just trying to contribute my take on this. Because the problem is, much of this information is out there. The problem is very scattered. So what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to draw it together and present it systematically. We've got this, that, and look, so that people can get a clearer view of what happened in what historical era. So yes, thankfully, the media are helping us there. But you probably also have noticed when you're searching the net how much of the old stuff is still being accepted by others. Yes?
How would you address when people say it's, there are 2 ways to look at it. It's an inappropriate translation from a linguistic standpoint, or is it a spin on how you feel about the topic?
Right. I think everything goes into the equation when people are discussing these things, because there's an emotional component for a lot of people. There is for me. I mean, today, according to current labels, I would say I'm a Christian gay man. So that definitely is part of my baggage. But that is not, and then some people, oh, well, then you're biased. Well, who isn't? That is my response.
I think it's not today, but to lay that onto the people that are writing. It's like that. There's an argument that it's just an inappropriate translation, it's just a linguistic error.
Yeah.
But then there's the layers of interpretation
Yes.
of what that means, and that it's more, it's not a linguistic issue, it's a theological issue.
Yes.
An issue of how to approach the topic. How would you
Well,
manage that conversation?
That is an interesting point. One of the points I'm raising over and over in my book is that there's been a huge amount of theology placed on top of the Bible with translations that were inadequate. So one of my main points is let us get these translations straightened out a little bit to find a consensus on how to translate these texts in a decent way that everyone can say, oh yeah, I can see this is better than what we had before. Because far too much theology rests on shaky translations. And that's a huge issue, isn't it? Because a large chunk of the debate that's going on in the media is connected to that problem. And even now, I don't have a stack of them, but you probably all know a great number of different English versions of the Bible coming out. Every year there's a new one appearing, isn't there? And they're all saying, well, you know, we feel a huge need to do it more accurately than our predecessors did a couple of years ago. And so, but unfortunately, in these texts, they're all using the same dictionaries. Because these words keep getting repeated that tell you this is about same-sex. Because you know, the where the dictionaries come from, they didn't come out of the blue. They were put together by people who found it interesting, but they were also colored by their own bias. In fact, the classical dictionary in Hebrew is about 100 years old, 110 maybe. And that was put together at the height of the Victorian era. So how can you expect it not to take a moral stand on this, and showing you where same-sex relations are wrong? So the words they have chosen for these dictionaries keep appearing even in modern translations. So this is where I feel my book is a contribution, saying, hey guys, in fact, maybe I've written this to fellow Bible translators. Maybe that's what the main concern I've had. I want them to read it. And that's why I'm talking so much about translation, driving some of my readers to despair. Because until we have a well-founded, reasonably, linguistically well-balanced translation, I feel it's much too early to discuss it, bring in all this emotion, you know, and all this controversy and all this passion into the debate. It is not in the right place. So I'm just asking, let us get the text straightened out first of all. And when in the process, you may discover there are other concerns that are being addressed in these texts that you were not aware of before. So that's another point I'm making in my book so many times.
I like what you, your observation that sometimes whole theologies, whole theological systems can be built on a very bad translation. And an example of this is a cherished doctrine in Western Christianity, our doctrine of original sin,
Yes.
which comes from Augustine.
Yes.
And it's shared by both classical Protestants and Roman Catholics.
Yeah.
And it's based upon one verse of scripture in Romans 5:12. That verse, that's Augustine builds his whole doctrine of original sin upon his understanding, but he did not read Greek. He was dependent on Jerome's Latin translation, and Jerome, in fact, mistranslated that verse. We know that because we can compare it with the Greek.
Yes.
But Augustine didn't bother to do that because he didn't care for Greek. And so this is why the Eastern Church has no notion of original sin, because it's not in the Greek text.
Right.
And even Western theologians who will acknowledge that Romans 5:12 cannot be used to support it, we still, out of tradition, hold on to this notion, Augustinian notion of original sin.
Yes.
Because it's built into our whole, to create a whole understanding and a worldview, a paradigm, based upon something that is, in fact, erroneous in its translation to begin with.
Yes.
Had Augustine been reading the Greek text, there may have never emerged this idea of original sin.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's a very good example of also, it probably goes to show when you sort of look at even Augustine as a person, some of his own struggles
Yeah.
came out as then a doctrine that was then spread all over the Christian world, and a huge chunk of it. But as you're rightly pointing out, the other tradition, the Eastern Order, has a very different take on that story, because they read it, and still do, read it in Greek, read it in Greek. So you have again language, how much it influences people's vision of the text. And interestingly, I'm just throwing this in as an apropos to your point, that when you go to the Jewish tradition, there are many meditations in the Jewish tradition about this story in Genesis, that is in Christianity is called the story of the fall. But Jews don't accept that because it doesn't show in the Hebrew. Again, because the language gives you a different idea. So one Jewish scholar I read, and I really like the title of the chapter he dedicated to Genesis 3. The title is, Did They Fall or Were They Pushed? Right.
I was thinking again about the passage of all this through history. It's sadly ironic how much more threatening social justice issues are than somebody else's bedroom.
Yes.
And it's a lot easier to condemn somebody else than to go help somebody else.
I believe you're right. There's a reason why that tradition sort of became embedded in Western Christianity, because that is very easy to pinpoint. But you know, the social issue thing, so it's a lot harder. You're quite right.
Yeah, and I have to extend myself a lot less. I mean, I don't have to do anything except talk on the point.
Yes, that's right.
There seems to be in Western Christianity an obsession with sexual morality. And we put that much more attention on social justice.
Yeah.
And the present Pope Francis wants to shift the emphasis away from sexual morality issues to social justice.
Yes.
And he's having a hard time doing that.
He is.
There's a resistance.
Because he has a lot of opposition on that one. But people are used to the other approach from the previous Pope. So we're seeing the struggle virtually in all churches today, I would say.
Yeah.
So translation is a much bigger issue than people realize when we deal with these issues, because goodness me, you could spend your life discussing other subjects too. But I have taken this up because I have been affected myself. And the pain and discomfort I felt as a young person when Sodom and Gomorrah was thrown into my face. It was like, ooh, it doesn't feel good. So that's where I'm coming from. And a lot of other people, as probably everyone knows, you have suffered similar problems and worse than I have experienced. So this is part of my motivating force. But I would also like to say, this is not just a work of anger and resentment and bitterness. I started out from there, definitely feeling unfairly treated and unfairly discriminated against. But I came out in a much better place because what I wasn't anticipating, I walked into all of these clobber texts or texts of terror, as some people call them. I walked in there and spent time with them. And I come out in a very different place. I now realize the truth of the old saying, you know, before you can actually overcome your demons, you have to know their name. Right? And I have spent time with my biblical demons. I now know their names and I can know their faces. It's like, oh, okay. Oh, I see. And I realized they all are making a different point than I thought when I first walked in there. So it has been a fantastic discovery of the Bible too, and it has deepened my faith. Wow. I'm seeing a lot more in there than I ever expected.
I would imagine it would cause you to love the biblical writers all the more.
It does.
So
It does.
it doesn't diminish the Bible, it actually enhances your love for Scripture.
I would say so. Yes.
Interesting.
Absolutely. Any other comments? I think we have a few more minutes in case.
But the virgin daughters are still getting offered up, aren't they?
Well, you know, thank you for bringing that up, because it took me quite a few pages to deal with that. They're different. Let me put it this way: we all have choices when we're interpreting the Bible. Many people forget this, because we're raised in a Christian tradition where there's one way of reading certain texts, but the Bible doesn't work that way. There's always different layers, different emphases, and you pick one and I take another. And that's, for me, part of the greatness of the Bible. It leaves room for many people to come in and interpret. So I don't go for a single interpretation, but some people do. And some people go for the one you just mentioned. You're seeing it in a lot of commentaries, aren't you? That Lot was a terrible father. How did he even dare to think, his two innocent daughters, to sacrifice them, throw them to the wolves? That's a very common understanding. I have a slightly different take that I'm struggling to make people accept, but for me it's more biblical. That's all I'm saying. So it's not that I'm more intelligent than everybody else, but I find it more biblical. And what is my interpretation of that scene? Well, you have,
That's me.
I want you to take it back very quickly to now we almost arrived. Here we go. The mistranslations, particularly to know in the biblical sense, it all builds on that. The idea that Lot is offering up his two daughters to sex-hungry men, all builds on the idea of to know in a biblical sense. And I have little time for this anymore. I'm not impressed by it anymore, because to know in a biblical sense, actually, if you really spend some time with that and look up all the other knowings that's going on, as well those in Genesis, you realize, no, the central angle doesn't really work here. Where it comes from is from the Greek translation. But in Greek, the ancient classical Greek comedians, they love to play on words. And to know, they would like to present it in ambiguous circumstances. So people have picked that up through the Greek translation, the Septuagint. And that, in Sodom and Gomorrah, the Greek translation is ambiguous. So people, okay. And that's how it snowballed from there. But in the Hebrew it isn't. You have 6 cases of to know, and the narrator uses the same word throughout. So he's not playing with it. And the first two, 18, 19, it is the deity thinking to himself about Abraham, saying, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm going to do in Sodom and Gomorrah? No, for I have known him. That's the first. So this is an important precedent when we get to this other say, I have known him. This means I have established a special relationship with Abraham. We have a covenant. 2:18-21. I will go down to Sodom and Gomorrah to see what happens, because an outcry has come before me. Let me know it. That's the second. Third, the men of Sodom, they have seen the 2 visitors that come to Lot's house. They arrive massively and knock and bring out the 2 visitors. Let us know them. And this is exactly the same grammatical form, let us know, as the deity said, let me know what's going on. So this is an investigative nature of knowing. The deity wants to go down to investigate the nature of the outcry coming out, and the men of Sodom want to investigate the nature of these visitors. Who are they? What are they doing here? How long are they going to stay? Etc. Third, and now we come to the tricky one. 19:8. This is where Lot then responds to the call by coming out, shutting the door behind him. The text is very clear that he doesn't want anybody to get into that house. And then he says, no, my brothers. He's trying, to strike a conciliatory tone. But he's a foreigner. So here comes Lot the foreigner saying, no, my brothers, don't do that. I cannot hand over my visitors. They have come under my roof. And if you treat somebody to a meal in that culture and they're staying at your house, you just don't hand them over to anybody that's showing up at your doorstep. That will be shameful. And shame is very important in this culture. So Lot then, he has to think very quickly here. What do I do instead? I don't know what you would do, but you're standing there watching all these people. I think, well, what am I going to do? So he throws out an alternative. Hoping, if I could. So he says, look here. I have 2 young daughters who have not known a husband. Do you get what I'm saying? All translators ignore the fact that man in Hebrew, whenever a woman is involved, very often means husband. Lot is actually saying, I have 2 young daughters here as yet unmarried. That is basically what he's saying. He's not saying what some translators want us to believe, that they haven't had sex. No. And respectable man in ancient times would not dream of saying such a thing. For many reasons. A, he just didn't do that in public. B, if any of your daughters had sex with somebody, do you think she would still be living at her father's house? Oh no. She would have been hounded out of town and made stoned. Called a prostitute. Okay? So God is not talking about sex here. He's talking about something that's more important. And now you come into, and you can read more details here because I don't want to tire you. Right? I mean, I can go on for hours. But it's a fascinating way, if you look at the way women relate to their husbands throughout the book of Genesis, you'll get quite a different picture of this. You have Abraham traveling with his wife Sarah. You probably remember that story. And they arrive in 2 countries where Abraham feels unsafe. Right? Oh my God, I don't know these people in here. How are they going to respond to me? And Sarah is a beautiful woman. So what will happen to me if they like her and they want to take her away? Ugh, maybe they'll kill me. So that's why he told, tell them you're my sister. And it goes well for him. You know, the trick works. But this is a way the head of the household, he can use a woman, in this case his wife, as a goodwill ambassador. If you have another example, in Jacob, you may remember he fled away from home after cheating his brother Esau, and then arrives at the house of Laban, his uncle, and the first person he meets is Rachel, and he falls madly in love with Rachel, who is a cute girl, and then finally, when they get married, he gets tricked, and because his uncle wants his older daughter to get married before the younger, so he gets 2, and then they add their slave women to him, so he ends up having 4 wives. He just wanted 1 and he got 4. That's right. Now, when Jacob leaves Laban with his wives and children, and, you know, all the cattle and all the rest of it. So it's a slow-moving caravan from there, right? But when he then reaches a place and he hears the news that Esau, his estranged brother, is coming towards him with 400 armed men, then you can imagine Jacob's state of mind. Uh-oh, this is a time of reckoning coming. Now, sweet revenge for Esau, right? So this is the night where you find him by himself. He goes to an isolated place and he wrestles, remember, all night long with this man who comes to him, an angel apparently, and says to him, I will not let you go until you bless me. And it's a gripping story, you know, and you can sort of feel Jacob's, you know, angst in every pore of his body, you know, he will not let it go, because he's desperate. He feels this may be his last hour. So in the morning, he then gets the solution. You can see that by the way he arranges himself. You now know he sent a gift ahead, hoping to placate the wrath of the bride. He sends a herd of cattle ahead as a gift, and then he arranges everything. And look at the way he does it. A normal person in their right minds in our culture, what would you do? You put the cattle and the material possession in front, and then the people, and finally the women and children, wouldn't you? That's perfectly normal in our culture. What does Jacob do? Exactly the opposite. Now, could it be that
Turn off the phone.
Could I suggest that we all turn off the sound? Because we're trying to YouTube this thing, and this is bad. I'll just turn mine off.
Right.
Please, thank you.
Sure. We live in a culture where we have many things to remember and think about. But what I'm saying about Jacob and his family, so Jacob does exactly the opposite. In front, his wives and their children, then the slaves, and then this couple and then all that, in the opposite order that we would do it. So again, you have an example of how women and children are used to diffuse tension. So I'm bringing those examples into the story of Solomon, where Lot here is he's in an undefendable position. He is a single lone foreigner living with his wife and 2 daughters in a house, and he cannot defend it against such huge, massive presence. I mean, there's nothing he can do. All he can do is try to diffuse tension. So he's suggesting, okay, I have these 2 young daughters here. They have not known a husband. They are fiancés, I mentioned a few verses later, 2 young men of Sodom who were going to marry his daughter. So this is, for me, it's pretty obvious. Sodom and Gomorrah is a legal text. You'll see that many times over legal terminology throughout. And this is another situation where I have 2 young daughters who have not known a husband. They're not officially married yet. You can have them. And then my understanding of it, and just mine personally, I haven't seen this elsewhere yet, and many people are probably going to hate me for it. But there it is. Take my 2 daughters as goodwill ambassadors, as a token of my goodwill. It's all I can give you. But let me keep my 2 visitors here for the duration of the visit. And then I imagine his deal, the deal he's proposing is, when this is done, we will barter. I'll have my daughters back, and then everything will be fine. He's also saying, because the men of Sodom are wanting to investigate this. He can feel the tension coming from them. They are really curious. They want to interrogate his visitors. And he cannot do this for hospitality reasons, right? So he is feeling that he has to make a real significant token here of his goodwill. And because women and children are under his authority, he can do it. But as far as I can see, there's nothing in the language here that invites us to understand it sexually. Because we bring that in to know in the biblical sense that we borrow from the Greek. And there's a further argument, if you're not entirely convinced yet, but if you go to the final 2 verses, there is a situation where it just hits the nail on the head. In these 2 verses, you have this rather unsavory scene for our sensibilities, where Lot has fled, the city has burned down, he's lost his wife, and he's ended up in this mountain cave with his 2 young daughters, right? And so he's in a bad state. He's lost all his possessions, he's lost his wife, and he's got nothing there except these 2 young girls, so he's in pretty bad shape. So the girls say to each other, they think they're the last survivors in this world, right? Everything has disappeared on us. So here we are, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to get old sometime, or rather our father's going to die soon, and then what we do, who's going to look after us when we're older? We need fresh blood, we need children. And what can we do? Well, if he's the only man around, well, let's go for it. And because he's in bad shape psychologically, he's very easy to tempt with a bottle of wine. So they get him drunk. And here you have the knowing come in and get him. Then you have the older daughter goes in first, sleeps with him that night, makes sure she gets pregnant, and so does the younger. And in each case it says, and he did not know in her lying down and in her getting up. And yet, each time they both get pregnant. So the knowing is clearly not sexual, because if it were, there would be a contradiction in the whole text. So what I'm saying is a more difficult interpretation. It takes longer to understand it, but for me it's far more biblical than the ones we're used to.
And that's really interesting, because I always presume the way the English text is in the story of the men of Sodom coming out the door, that they wanted to have sexual relations with the 2 strangers that had come to visit. But in fact, they just wanted to be married with them.
Yes.
It could be argued, so it may not have a sexual connotation.
It may not at all. But we're so much indebted to the Greek and Latin translations that we automatically think
that's what we...
That's right. But the more you look at the Hebrew text and relate these different occurrences of the verb to know in it, you can see it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. And it also would make more sense.
It would.
Yeah.
And it does make more
Because they're
sense.
strangers they want to interrogate,
Yes.
which they haven't really even seen them, and they want to rape them.
That's right. And in fact, I feel it makes more sense also when you look at the text. On 2 occasions in the story, it is emphasized that the men of Sodom were all there, from young to old, I mean from boy to old man. And then later on, and many translators get this wrong, it is the same information is given but in a different wording. There it says from lowly to high, from low to high, means from slave to ruler. So the social dimension is there, the age dimension is there in the Hebrew. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this is Sodom has a king. He's just not mentioned in this story, which is why so many people sort of don't really, they think, oh well, this is probably, they all decided they want to hear, we want to have sex.
Yeah.
Ancient cultures didn't work that way.
Yeah.
They were hierarchical. There were kings and there were rulers and there were all kinds of things going on. And in Genesis 14, you have the king of Sodom described in detail. His name is Bera. He's mentioned in Genesis 14. So when from low to high are mentioned in this story, it means the king is there too. He's just sort of pushed into the background a little bit because there's a drama, so there's a drama can unfold even more poignantly. Like, it's brilliant technique from the narrator's part, but the king is clearly there, implied. And this is, anyway, I'm getting all passionate.
No, this is really good.
Good question.
Yes.
So if they were all there, then what did they suspect that these 2 strangers were? Could they have been spies from some other area that they might be attacking the city?
Yes, but there's a whole lot happening that people have missed before this particular part of the story. The story of Sodom begins before this whole scene, quite a bit before. In fact, early on in Genesis, it's mentioned that the state of Sodom was founded by Canaanites. So there's a point here. This is not an Israelite. They're not related to Abraham. And Lot, the moment he leaves Abraham and moves to Sodom, that means he's actually changing his culture and moving into a different territory here. So there's all these implications around Sodom. And then you have the story in Genesis 14 where the king of Sodom, Bera is his name, and the other kings of Gomorrah and the neighboring towns, they form an alliance to shake off the yoke imposed by, I think it's the Assyrian Empire. One of these empires that have conquered the territory and imposed, tremendous taxation on them. So they want to shake this off. So they form an alliance, but it doesn't go very well for them. So they actually they lose the battle, etc. So they're in pretty bad shape by the time we arrive at the story here. So they've had this rather traumatic experience of war and so on. So when they see 2 strangers coming in, what are they now up to? Right? Do they represent the enemy coalition, or what is it? So all of those things are going on, which I feel gives us a rather realistic picture. There's a tense atmosphere this time around Sodom. So 2 strangers, and they not only that, they have moved in with a stranger in town who himself became confused. What's going on here?
Yeah.
I think, there's a certain logic to the whole thing.
It's a more natural reading.
It is. It is. And this also, for me, helps far understand the prophets better. They never mention sex, not even once, in relation to Sodom. They are seeing these other things happening. How are we doing for time?
Good.
Good. Let's see, what did we say on the little sheet? I forgot what
Yes.
we could, my thought was we would go to about 11:30 and then we have our lunches and we can discuss in a half hour there
Okay.
and then move into section 2.
Okay. Excellent.
Just to validate your point, I opened up the New Living Translation version of the Bible.
Which one?
NLT, New Living Translation.
New Living Translation.
That's a fairly recent edition, and it definitely translated as send them out so we can have a good time.
Send them out so that what?
Send them out so they can be, had sex with them.
Yeah.
So they,
That's what it says
Yeah.
blatantly in English.
yeah.
Several
Well,
English,
that's so interpreted, it's not.
yes,
Okay, yes.
several English versions today, and people are reading them, say literally, send them out to us so that we can have sex with them.
That's what
That's
this
right.
says.
Yeah.
That's the point you're making. And they are there, and people are reading them. So small wonder that we have quite a problem here.
I really, in the introduction to your book, I appreciated your conversation about simple translation. That you know, if you want to control the masses, give them a simple translation.
Yes.
And the tremendous choices that are interpretive choices that are made in simplifying things.
Very much so. Very much so. This is an important point because, you know, today it's become quite fashionable to produce these easy-to-read versions. They're very popular. I can see why, you know, because it does make everything easier for you. The problem is you're throwing out quite a bit of stuff with the bathwater when you're doing this, because there were, in ancient times, there never was an easy-to-read version. This is a modern invention.
But if you're from the Reformed tradition where you don't need a mediator between yourself and God, because it's so easy to understand.
That's right. So the issue we have here, I mean, I'm not against easy-to-read versions if you tread carefully, right? But particularly in these texts, some of them are not treading very carefully. They're bringing it far too, making far too obvious what is not really in the text.
Yeah.
So, and the issue here is because the Bible never existed in an easy-to-read version, okay? It was always sophisticated and written by educated persons. It's very obvious from the, at least from the manuscripts we have today, we can see, gosh, this is actually brilliant literature. I would say parts of Genesis, including the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, is Shakespearean.
Yes.
In literary artistry.
Yeah.
The way they leave out things and leave you guessing, and then add another little bit of information, ooh, what's going on here? They're leaving a lot for you to interpret here. And I think it's brilliant. And so when you are producing an easy-to-read version, you're leaving out all the difficult parts and giving them the easy version you think is there. You see what I mean? So I'm not against it because, you know, there are children who need an easy-to-read version. There are people with little English who might want it, and so on. So this is not my point. My point, be careful and don't think this is the gospel. You will need to go to a serious academic version if you want the whole picture. Yes.
But I really appreciate the idea of putting the material into historical context and going back and picking up these other passages about what's going on, you know, at that point in time in order to understand the text, the Hebrew text.
Yeah.
Very, very important. And then you could write an understandable version of what's going on, as long as the historical context is understood.
Yes.
Because it makes sense, as you just said. It makes much more sense.
Well, each time we translate, we are that much further removed from the original author. People think they're reading the Bible, but what they're really reading is a translation of the Bible. And so they're dependent upon the translator's biases and choices that he made in how to translate that.
Yes.
And then if you do these easy-to-read versions like the Message or the Living Bible, then you are further removed from the original author. You just move further away. So it actually obscures the original meaning rather than clarify it.
Yes. I tend to agree with you there because any translation, I mean, anyone who's tried their hand at translating whatever can see this is an interpretation.
Yeah.
Right? Because you need to make sense of the text you're reading, and then you need to express it in an adequate way in the other language.
There's
Right?
not a word-for-word equivalent.
Right, there isn't.
Doesn't
I mean,
exist.
some people have tried to make machine translation for that. I mean, they have their own problems.
Yeah.
So every translation in this world is an interpretation. That is obvious for me. And so, as you are rightly pointing out, this is true for any translation, also the very academic ones with all the footnotes. But in addition to that, when you then make an easy-to-read version, you are in fact translating it twice. You're translating it in the complex original text into a complex text in English. And then you're making it easy, so you're just distilling from there into an easy to read version. So it's a two-tier rocket process you're involved in. So this, people should remember this. But many of those who are debating and expressing very strong views on this issue, they're using such version every day, even as we speak. So we have a long way to go. Yes.
I also wanted to say that I think that going to Isaiah and Ezekiel, the examples that you gave, is wonderful, because there we've got people who are writing in that language and are interpreting the text in a meaningful way that has totally escaped most of us.
Yes. Yes. In fact, I would say the prophets have escaped most of us. And they are, for me, an extremely moving part of the Hebrew Scriptures. And really thought-provoking, many of the things they're saying. Because they're going on, and I think this may be that why people don't like them. They talk a lot about idolatry, worshipping the wrong gods, over and over. And I am now in a different place with them. I'm thinking, okay, well, we don't do that, do we? And it really raises the question, who are our idols today?
I have a picture in my wall.
Here it is, right? So I feel they are as relevant as ever for this context and many others. Yes, Mike?
Do you have a favorite version of the Bible that you find to be more in line with the original scholarship?
I wish I could say just plain yes to that.
I knew you would be.
I'm hoping it will appear, and if my book can help produce that version, I would really be happy.
Are you familiar with Alter?
Robert Alter is a very interesting scholar. I've learned a lot from his scholarship.
I love his translations.
He has produced some very amazing work, and I'm quoting him a lot in my book.
Yes.
Where I disagree with him a little bit is for example around Lot's daughters, because there he takes a traditional view.
Okay.
But that does not mean that he has little to say on other issues. So, but that happens a lot when you're engaging with scholars. You'll find, oh God, this is wonderful, and then you turn the page, oh, okay. That's not really what I'm at. But I mean, such is the case. He's a great scholar, Robert Alter, and he's translated Genesis. I think my favorite translation of Genesis, I can say yes to that, was written by a lady called Mary Korczak, and she called it At the Start. So this is about Genesis. And what this is pretty obvious. Exactly. And where it all began. So what she has done, and I liked it, it helped me a lot as I was moving into this territory, because she has done it as much as good, a literal, I would say almost comma for comma translation. And it sort of bears the text for you. The English, because there's not all and this and so on and so forth, and all that stuff we add to our sentences. That's all gone. So she just goes to the very, very basics, and so and God said, let there be light. So bing, 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 and after you read a few pages, I said, this is a different way of doing it, isn't it? But it does give you a good impression of the way the Hebrew works, because she stays close to the style of the Hebrew. So for me, it was an eye-opener to read that one. And then at the start, Genesis made new, is what she called it.
Well, even the title, At the Start, is a literal translation of the first line, Genesis.
Yeah. Well, this is her way of saying it. Like, at the start,
I'm sorry.
yeah, it's interesting. But what I like about it gives you a fresh
Yes.
perspective on the text that most of us have. Because we all use the and while and in the meantime and whatever else goes in there, and then disappears from here. So I find it really, really helpful. So that would be my best bet, but it's only Genesis. I often use for the Older Testament, but with certain reservations, maybe the New Revised Standard Version, because overall it does a pretty decent job. One thing I like about the New Revised Standard Version is they dare to put in just a few footnotes here and there, you know, telling you, for example, the meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain. I love that one. Because I mean, okay, there's a problem word here, we don't really know what it is, but here's a suggestion. I like that. Because that still leaves you with room for, if you find another translation maybe it's better, but we don't really know what the word means. And I think this is the honest approach. And that is another problem with the easy-to-read versions. There's no footnotes in there. They give the impression everything is fine and dandy, we've solved all problems, just go for it. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. There are at least 200 words in the Hebrew Scriptures we don't know what they mean, because they only occur once. So you're in trouble. You have no other text you can refer to. So in those cases, I would like to have a look. And the New Revised Standard Version does a fairly nice job on that, particularly in the Older Testament. Maybe in the Newer Testament, more or less average, but the Older Testament is pretty good. But there's still, well, I could go on and on about this for long. But how are we doing for time?
3 more minutes, and then we'll pass out the lunches and continue our conversation.
Right.
I have a question.
Yes.
Have you done a presentation before any, say, evangelicals or ones that follow that? What was the reaction? Have they been open or not?
Thank you for that question. Actually, while I was still doing my PhD, before I finished this work, but I was in the middle of it, I attended an international conference, and in a different capacity actually. I didn't even know I was going to have time for this. But then there was a lull in the middle where I was taken off duty from other tasks I was supposed to perform for a couple of days. So I said, okay, well maybe I could offer a workshop on my PhD work on Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So I offered that, and I didn't expect many people to show up because it was last minute. And you know, everything else was in the program, so I said, well, if 2 or 3 people show up, that's fine. And 50 people came to this little classroom I had found, and they were sitting in the windowsills and on the floor. It was amazing. And these people came from all over the world, from different traditions and different biblical approaches. And I had a very interesting experience there. What I basically did was I shared the problems I was finding in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and how I was trying to overcome them or solve them. I shared my struggle with them, and you should have seen their faces. Ooh, all over the room. And it was amazing, actually. So I realized, because quite a lot of them were staunch evangelicals. I knew that. I could see even when they walked in, ooh, they're here too. But I mean, but the interesting thing was we met somewhere in the middle. They felt my passion for this work, for this text, and okay. So I thought, well, there's something here I can maybe pick up and learn from. And but by the time I finished, only like 20 hands went up in the air. They were not aggressive, but they were full of questions. Tough questions, some of them, but there was no aggression in the air. And the interesting thing was, so I realized, yes, if you are serious about Bible study, and you really care about the Bible and it shows in the way you treat with it, there's somewhere at least room for common ground. That was a great experience for me. And just on an anecdotal note, maybe I can say that I noticed one man from somewhere in Africa saying to another as they were leaving a room, I think I'm changing my mind on this. And another, this woman, she came over to me, she's from the States, from somewhere in the Bible Belt, I'm sure. She came over to me and said, You may have a point about Sodom and Gomorrah, but you can't do anything about Leviticus. And off you go.
So I'm finding an increasing number of my evangelical friends who just do not want to, they're sympathetic to inclusivity, and they know people now who are homosexual, and yet they feel trapped by the text.
Yeah.
So it's not because they're homophobic, it's because they're worried about their whole theological system collapsing because they have a certain view of the text.
Yes.
So I can see where this presentation, you can still have this kind of view of the text, but it's not threatening to my faith.
Right.
And other things, it just clarifies what's already there.
Especially with younger evangelicals, I know quite a few of them, and they just don't have any patience for that
Yeah.
exclusivity stuff. I mean,
Right.
they're definitely evangelical, but they're no longer mean about it.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely.
So lots going on today that we haven't seen before,
Yes.
even among the evangelicals.
That's right.
Shall we distribute the lunches and then continue talking?
Sure.
Who was the vegetarian lunch?
Me.
Okay.